There are moments when a war ends on paper, but keeps going, just in a different form. Because the Cold War wasn't only missiles and speeches. It was a silent wager. When the final collision comes, whoever has the better machine and the better way to use it wins. For decades, that collision felt inevitable. United States versus Soviet Union, tank versus tank, steel versus steel. The battle the world expected to see on the plains of Europe. But the real duel didn't happen in Germany. It didn't happen in Berlin. And it didn't happen where Moscow planned it. It happened in the desert. In the early 1990s, the Iraqi night looked perfect for hiding anything. Sand swallowed sound. Darkness swallowed distance. And out there, shapes began to appear. Heavy silhouettes, low and brutal, holding still for a moment, like they were too confident to worry. And that's where a Soviet idea, built to win a war that never came, met a war that came for real. The T-72 was born to be the hammer of an invasion. Simple, tough, mass-produced, designed to keep moving no matter what. To many, it became the symbol of the most frightening Soviet advantage: numbers, force, inevitability. But that night, the T-72 didn't find Europe. It found a war with different rules, because on the other side was something that didn't feel like a normal tank. It felt like a predator. The M1 Abrams didn't need to be close. It didn't need to see with human eyes. And it didn't need to warn you. While some crews were still trying to make out shadows on the horizon, others were already selecting targets. And what followed wasn't an even fight between two military schools. It was a collision with reality. In just a handful of encounters, it became clear the world had spent years fearing the wrong tank, or at least fearing it in the wrong way. And when this story ends, one thing becomes impossible to ignore. The T-72 was built to win a war that never came, and it lost brutally in the war that did. The T-72 didn't become famous because it was the most advanced tank on Earth. It became famous for something simpler and more terrifying: math. Because the T-72 wasn't built to be perfect. It was built to be repeatable, cheap enough to be produced in massive numbers, simple enough to be learned fast, tough enough to keep moving even when the plan went wrong. And that combination created a reputation that spread far beyond the tank itself. The fear wasn't, what can this one tank do? The fear was, how many of these can show up, and how fast? That's why the T-72 became a symbol, not of elegance, not of innovation, but of a brutal formula the Soviets believed in. Quantity plus aggression plus speed equals victory. In that worldview, you didn't need the best machine. You needed the machine that could keep coming. Again, and again, and again. And meanwhile, on the other side, the Americans were building something that looked like the exact opposite approach. The M1 Abrams looked heavy, complicated, expensive. To a lot of people, it didn't look like a practical war machine. It looked like a luxury project. A tank built by the richest country on Earth, for a war it couldn't afford to fight. So for years, the story sounded obvious. The Soviets were building an army. The Americans were building a showpiece. And the T-72 felt inevitable. Not like a weapon, but like weather. A steel rain you couldn't stop. Only survive. On paper, the T-72 looked like the perfect answer. Low, fast, armed. Simple enough to exist by the thousands. And from a distance, it's easy to believe the fear was in the metal. But war isn't a spec sheet. War is friction. It's dust getting into places it shouldn't. Heat changing how an engine behaves. A slow leak that turns into a failure. A radio that cuts out at the worst possible second. Ammo that didn't come from the ideal batch. Maintenance done too fast because there's no time. A crew running on adrenaline and fatigue, trying to make perfect decisions in seconds. And that's when you run into the truth people rarely said out loud. A tank is never just a tank. It's the entire world behind it. The T-72 was designed as part of a massive machine. It was never meant to be a lone hero. It was meant to work inside a chain. Doctrine, spare parts, fuel, maintenance, training, command, repeated until it becomes reflex. When that chain is intact, the T-72 is terrifying. But when one link breaks, the legend starts to crack. And this isn't about humiliating soldiers, it's about systems. Because courage doesn't replace spare parts, discipline doesn't create fuel, and determination doesn't make optics work if the structure behind them can't keep up. There's a reason people confuse the tank with the army. For decades, the T-72 wasn't just a vehicle. It was a symbol of an idea: mass, simplicity, inevitability. But when it spread across the world, it didn't spread as one perfect T-72. It multiplied into versions, variants, export models, different standards, different realities. And in practice, that means something simple. Not every T-72 you meet is the same T-72. Sometimes it looks identical from the outside, but inside, it's a different machine. Different sensors, different reliability, different maintenance standards the unit can actually sustain, even different training, how the crew was taught to fight, communicate, and survive. And then you hit the detail that decides battles, but rarely makes it into dramatic headlines. Two tanks with the same gun can still be two completely different worlds, because the gun doesn't decide who wins. What decides it is who sees first, who understands what they're seeing, who measures distance with precision, who communicates faster, who lands the first shot, who keeps tempo when everything turns to chaos. On paper, the T-72 was built for a planned war. In the real world, it could become an animal outside its habitat. And in 1991, the habitat changed completely. Because this wasn't the war it was born to fight. This wasn't the ideal scenario of a full Soviet-style system. Layers of support, resupply, and a gigantic structure behind it. This was a different war, with different rules, different limitations, different failures. And when the world behind the tank isn't the same, the tank stops being a legend and becomes metal trying to survive. That's where the question shifts. It's no longer which tank is better. It becomes a much more dangerous question. Which tank stays lethal when the system behind it starts to break? And this is where the story begins to turn. Because on the other side was a tank that wasn't built to be simple. It was built to dominate chaos. And when that collision finally happened, it wasn't a fair comparison between two schools of design. It was a brutal reality check. The moment you understand why the Abrams changed everything, you stop thinking of it as a vehicle. You start thinking of it as a hunter. Because the real advantage wasn't just armor, and it wasn't just the gun. It was something far more unfair than that. The Abrams could see you when you couldn't even see the battlefield. In the desert, night doesn't feel like dark. It feels like distance disappears. Shapes turn into guesses. And every second you spend trying to confirm what you're looking at is a second where you can die. For decades, most crews fought night battles the hard way, with limited optics, crude night systems, and a lot of faith. But the Abrams didn't rely on faith. It had thermal vision. And thermal vision is not night vision. It's not a flashlight. It's not a green image where you still struggle to separate a rock from a turret. Thermal is a different reality. It turns the battlefield into heat signatures, engines, exhaust, warm tracks, human bodies, metal that's been running for hours. In that world, a tank doesn't hide by turning off its lights. A tank hides by being cold. And in Iraq, nothing was cold. So the Abrams crews weren't looking into the dark. They were looking at a map of living targets. And then comes the second part, the part people underestimate because it's invisible. What happens between spotting and killing? The Abrams wasn't built for get close and fight it out. It was built for a system that turns detection into destruction before the enemy can react. Spot, range, calculate, fire, not as a dramatic sequence, as a habit. The Abrams had a laser rangefinder, so distance wasn't guesswork. It had a ballistic computer, so the gun wasn't aimed, it was solved. Wind, angle, motion, range, processed instantly. So instead of walking shots in, the Abrams could deliver what mattered most in armored combat, a first-round hit. And when you combine thermal vision with that accuracy, something ugly happens. You don't get a tank duel. You get an execution at distance. But the Abrams' advantage wasn't just the machine, it was the crew. Because a hunter isn't dangerous if it panics. A hunter is dangerous because it stays calm and repeats the process. Abrams crews were trained to fight as a system. Short, disciplined communication. Clear roles. Fast target handoffs. In many older designs, the commander and gunner are locked into the same moment. They're both seeing the same thing, reacting to the same thing, fighting one target at a time. But the Abrams introduced a rhythm that feels almost modern. While the gunner is engaging a target, the commander is already hunting the next one. So the moment a target dies, there's no pause, no searching, no confusion, just the turret snapping to the next heat signature. And that rhythm creates the most brutal advantage of all: tempo. You're not just killing the enemy, you're outrunning their ability to understand what's happening. That's why the Abrams didn't need to be close. It could kill from ranges where the other side didn't even know what direction death was coming from. And after firing, it didn't sit there waiting to get lucky. It moved. Because another unfair part of the Abrams wasn't about speed across a map. It was about speed in the moment. It could reposition quickly, shift angle, disappear behind terrain, change the geometry of the fight before the enemy had time to respond. So the pattern looked like this: see first, hit first, and already be moving. When the enemy finally realizes they're in a battle, that's not a tank brawl, that's hunting, and you have to imagine what that feels like from the other side. You're in a T-72. It's night. Dust in the air. You know there are enemy tanks somewhere out there, but you can't confirm anything. Then a flash, then a nearby vehicle is gone, then another. No warning, no visible attacker, no clean line of sight. Just sudden destruction that feels like it's coming from the darkness itself. At that point, you can be brave, you can be skilled, but you're still fighting blind. And the Abrams wasn't blind. It was built for exactly that moment. When the battlefield turns chaotic, visibility collapses, and the system behind you starts to fail. That's why when people talk about Desert Storm and say it was one-sided, they're not just talking about tanks. They're talking about something deeper, a Cold War weapon finally meeting a real war, and proving it was designed to win the kind of fight the other side never truly prepared for. And in the next part, we'll see what happens when that hunter finally finds its prey. Because the war didn't end in Europe. It ended in the desert. Where this story takes place matters just as much as the tanks. Because Iraq wasn't Europe. No thick forests, no villages every few miles, no rolling hills constantly breaking sightlines. It was the opposite. It was distance, a battlefield that felt too open, too flat, and at night, too empty. The desert looks simple, until you understand what it does to the advantage of information. By day, it lies to you. Heat bends the horizon. Mirages turn silhouettes into guesses. Every movement kicks up dust that hangs in the air like a permanent veil. And at night, the desert becomes the perfect stage for anyone who has sensors. Because desert night isn't just dark. It's the loss of reference points. No streetlights, no tree line, no familiar shapes. Distance becomes harder to judge. Movement becomes harder to confirm. And certainty becomes rare. That's when war stops being who has the bigger gun and becomes who sees first. This is where the Abrams starts to feel like it's playing a different game. What looked like a black, dusty void to one side became a clean heat map to the other. Engines glowing. Vehicles leaving warm tracks behind them. Crews turning into living signatures. And the wide-open terrain, which you'd think would simply favor seeing far, actually favors one very specific thing: killing far. Because when you have range, stabilization, fire control computing, and thermal vision, every extra meter is an advantage. You don't need to close the distance just to be sure. You confirm on the sight, measure with the laser, and let the computer solve the shot. The desert hands you long lines of engagement like an endless corridor. Now add another brutal detail. There's very little cover. In many places, if you take fire, you disappear behind something. A hill, a building, thick vegetation. In the desert, a lot of the time, there is no something. Just shallow dips, low berms, and miles of empty space. That creates a cruel effect. The side that gains the first detection advantage also controls the tempo. Because if you're being hit from long range, and you can't even tell from where, shoot back isn't the first step. First you have to find the enemy. And while you search, you're the target. Dust makes it worse. It doesn't just reduce visibility. It multiplies confusion. Explosions, wind, moving vehicles. Everything lifts dust into the air. For conventional optics, it's like fighting inside a cloud. For thermal sights, it's often just an inconvenience. The engine still radiates. The vehicle still outlines. The target still exists. So the desert becomes an amplifier. What was already an advantage becomes control. And then there's the final layer, the one that turns advantage into dominance, coordination. In armored warfare, one great tank isn't enough. What wins is the ability to turn information into action, fast, consistently, across a unit. And in open terrain, with long ranges, decisions are made before the classic visual contact. You don't bump into the enemy. You detect. You identify. You assign. You engage. That requires clear comms, disciplined crews, a culture where the first shot matters. When one side has better sensors and better coordination, something strange happens. The other side always feels late. They're reacting to impacts, not movements. They learn where the enemy is only after they lose a vehicle. They confirm the threat only after they're already under fire. They start maneuvering when the window is already closed. On paper, people call this a technology gap. In reality, it feels like helplessness, like the battlefield is lit up for one side and turned off for the other. That's why Desert Storm became so revealing. It wasn't just Abrams versus T-72. It was an environment designed to prove a thesis. Give the hunter space, night, and dust. And if the hunter has better eyes than you do, you're not walking into a fair fight. You're walking into a hunting ground. And from here, the story gets even more specific. Because now we put a date and a moment on it. When the sandstorm hit, and targets started appearing like ghosts in a thermal sight, the Cold War's promised duel finally happened. Just not in the way anyone expected. It didn't break slowly. It broke in a moment. The kind of moment where confidence doesn't have time to turn into fear, because fear arrives already completed. Out there, in the open desert, units were moving the way armored units always move. Cautious, scanning, trying to read a landscape that gives you almost nothing back. Visibility wasn't bad. It was wrong. A sandstorm had turned distance into a wall. Headlights were useless. Optics were guesses. Shapes appeared, and then didn't. And that's the trap. In conditions like that, the side that relies on eyesight starts driving like it's blind. But the side that relies on heat is still reading the world clearly. For the crews inside Abrams tanks, the storm wasn't the enemy. It was cover. Inside the thermal sight, targets didn't look like shadows. They looked like presence, solid, glowing, undeniable. A rectangle of heat where an engine sat. A line of warmth where tracks had been moving. A cluster of signatures where vehicles were parked, waiting, convinced the weather protected them. That's what makes 73 Easting feel unreal from the outside. One side thinks the storm means nobody can see anything. The other side thinks, perfect. Now they can't see us. And then it happens. Not with a dramatic warning. Not with a long exchange. With a single engagement that lands like a punch. A target appears in the sight, briefly. A quick confirmation. A gun settles. And then, a flash. One tank is there, and then it isn't. No heroic pause. No time to understand. Just the immediate sickening realization that the battlefield has rules you weren't briefed on. The next target appears. A fraction of a second where the crew is still trying to process the first hit, and the second vehicle is already being engaged. This is the rhythm that made these encounters so psychologically brutal. Target appears, shot, silence, next target. Not chaos, not panic fire. Cold repetition. The kind that feels less like a battle, and more like a system working as designed. For the people on the receiving end, it didn't feel like being outgunned. It felt like being erased, because the worst part wasn't the impact. It was what came before it. They didn't see muzzle flashes. They didn't see movement. They didn't even know where to point the gun. Some crews fired into the storm because firing back is what you do when you're being hit. But they weren't firing at targets. They were firing at darkness. And that's where the Cold War duel turns into something else. Because in your mind, a tank fight is two machines meeting, each one seeing the other, each one trading blows. What happened in those decisive encounters was different. One side was fighting a visible enemy. The other side was fighting a direction, a feeling, a sudden impact from a place the storm refused to reveal. And when you don't know where the shots are coming from, every second stretches. You start to imagine enemies everywhere. You start to hesitate. You start to move when you should be shooting, and shoot when you should be moving. And the Abrams crews, they didn't need drama. They just needed a pattern. Spot, range, fire. Spot, range, fire. And that's the moment the myth breaks. Not because the T-72 suddenly becomes bad, but because, in that kind of fight, being blind is fatal, even if your gun is still loaded. This is where the Cold War ends in the most humiliating way possible. Not with a treaty, not with a parade, but with a battlefield lesson delivered in the dark. A lesson that says, you can have armor, you can have numbers, you can have a reputation, but if the other side sees you first, then the fight is over before it starts. And after those encounters, the story stops being which tank was better. It becomes something colder. One side discovered the future. and the other side arrived too late to survive it. When people hear what happened, they usually jump to the simplest explanation. They had the better tank. That's not wrong, but it's not the full truth either. Because what unfolded in the desert wasn't just a contest of metal versus metal, it was a contest of systems. And you can explain the massacre without drowning in technical talk by boiling it down to three simple pillars: eyes, brain, teeth. That's it. Eyes. Who could actually see the fight? In the desert, especially at night, vision is power. Not vision as in eyesight. Vision as in who can detect the enemy before the enemy even knows you're there. The T-72 crews were often operating with a night fight problem they couldn't solve fast enough. In sand, smoke, darkness, and distance, the world turns into guesswork. The Abrams didn't need guesswork. It could read the battlefield. Not perfectly, not magically, but clearly enough that the first contact didn't feel like two tanks meeting. It felt like one tank is already selected before it's even aware it's been spotted. And that's the first unfair advantage. If you can see first, you choose when the fight begins. If you can't, the fight begins on you. Brain. How fast could they think as a unit? A tank isn't just a gun on tracks. It's a crew under pressure. It's radio discipline. It's the ability to act without confusion when everything is loud, dusty, and terrifying. And this is where the system part matters, because when you get hit unexpectedly, the next 10 seconds decide everything. Do you freeze? Do you scatter? Do you fire randomly? Do you call it in clearly? Do you reposition as a team or break into individual panic? The Abrams crews were trained to fight like a coordinated hunting pair, sometimes a whole pack. One crew finds, another engages. Positions are shared. Targets are handed off. The unit keeps moving, keeps its spacing, keeps its rhythm. Meanwhile, if your doctrine assumes you'll fight at closer range, in clearer conditions, with simpler coordination, a night desert engagement is like being thrown into someone else's sport mid-game. And that's the second unfair advantage. It's not just the machine. It's the habit of how the machine is used. Under stress, at speed, as a group. Teeth. Could they finish the job immediately? This is the part everyone understands instinctively. When the shot comes, does it count? Because in combat, almost is dangerous. An enemy you fail to stop can still shoot back. A target you damage can still block your advance. A fight you don't finish becomes a brawl. And brawls are where luck kills you. The Abrams was built around one brutal idea: end the engagement before it turns into an exchange. Not after 5 shots. Not after adjusting fire. Not after a dramatic duel. Find, hit, eliminate, move on. That's why the encounters felt so one-sided. Not because the other side never fired, but because the side that fired first often fired decisively, and then immediately repeated the process on the next target. The real conclusion. So yes, people call it a massacre. But a massacre isn't a mystery when the structure is this simple. Eyes decide who starts the fight. Brain decides who stays coherent inside the fight. Teeth decide who survives the first 30 seconds. And this is the line that ties it all together. The T-72 lost before the first shot, because it entered the night without being able to see the night. Once that happens, the rest isn't a fair contest. It's a sequence, a system doing what it was designed to do, against another system that never got to fight the war it trained for. There's a reason this story never stops being rewatched. Because for a brief moment, the Cold War, this massive, decades-long argument, stopped being theory and became footage. Not speeches, not posters, not parades, results, and the world watched it like a live report card. The myth wasn't just that the T-72 was good. The myth was bigger than a tank. The myth was, mass will always beat mastery. That if you build enough steel, enough barrels, enough armored silhouettes, the numbers will carry you forward. In the desert, that myth didn't just crack. It shattered. And what made it feel like humiliation wasn't even the destruction itself. War destroys things. It was the asymmetry. One side was fighting a night war with a system designed for the night. The other side arrived with a machine that looked terrifying on paper, but couldn't turn darkness into clarity. That's why people call it a massacre. Because it didn't feel like two equals colliding. It felt like one side discovered the rules had changed after the game already started. What changed after that? First, reputation. For years, the T-72 had a kind of aura, a symbol, a warning. After Desert Storm, that aura got rewritten into a different kind of headline, feared until it met reality. Second, exports. Because once a weapon becomes a global product, perception becomes part of its value. Every country that bought Soviet armor, every army that planned around it, was forced to ask an uncomfortable question. If this is how it performs, when the enemy can see first, what happens to us? Third, doctrine. If your entire philosophy is built on closing distance, swarming, and overwhelming, then long-range night fighting is a nightmare you can't solve with courage alone. The lesson wasn't the Soviets were stupid. That's lazy. The lesson was sharper and scarier. A machine is only as strong as the system behind it. Training, maintenance, logistics, sensors, command, coordination. The metal is the visible part. The invisible part is what decides the outcome. And that's exactly why this story is addictive. Because it isn't just about tanks, it's about an entire worldview getting checked in real time. Hook for the next video, and if this felt unfair, if it felt like one side brought the future to a fight, the other side expected to be familiar, then you're going to love what comes next. Because Desert Storm wasn't the only time Soviet intelligence misread a technology and paid for it. Next time, another invention they thought they understood, until it humiliated them in the real world.